In section 2, we're going to talk about potential problems with sampling. More importantly, we're going to talk about bias. So just a definition for bias. So samples are biased if they are systematically not representative of the desired population. So what that means is that certain responses are systematically favored over others. And there's a lot of different forms of bias, which is what we're going to spend most of the notes talking about, are the different forms of bias. So as I mentioned in section 1, voluntary response is one of the worst ways to collect data. And I said I would go into more detail in section 2. So the first type of bias is called voluntary response bias. So it's such a poor way to collect data, it has its own bias. So the reason why it has a bias is because it's comprised entirely of volunteers or people who choose to participate. So the sample is not representative of the population at all. So it's very heavily biased. So we've talked about a couple examples already, but for example, a radio talk show host asked listeners to call in with their opinions of making wearing masks in public spaces mandatory. So the people who feel very strongly about this, whether that's strongly against it or strongly for it, are the ones who are more likely to call in. So it is biased. Another type of bias is called undercoverage. So what it does is when some groups in the population are left out of the process of choosing a sample. So undercoverage is very common in the census that we talked about in section 1. So it was very, very popular in 1990 because immigrants from Latin America were fearful of government intrusion. They did not return their census questionnaire for the 1990 census, which led to us having a very, very underrepresented Latin American information in our census. But it can happen in a lot of other things for undercoverage. And the next one is non-response. So if you're chosen for a sample, but you can't be contacted or you refuse to respond, that's an example of non-response. So that is a very, very common thing in mail surveys. People just choose not to respond. Or if, someone walks up to you on the street and asks you to answer their survey and you say no, non-response. So kind of like an example here, if a school administration sent out 100 surveys to a sample of parents in order to gauge their attitudes towards returning to school in 2020, and only 23 responded, that's non-response. Those 23 people is not a lot if you sent out 100 surveys. All right, next we're going to talk about some more specific types of bias that are related to something called response bias. So response bias is bias caused by the behavior of either the respondent, which is the person who's being asked, or the interviewer. So it can either be the person who's being asked or the person who's asking the questions. And there's a lot of different types of response bias. One of them is called untruthful answers. And that's basically, the definition is what it says. People give untruthful answers. And there's a lot of different reasons as to why people might give untruthful answers. Some of them, it could be that this question is sensitive in nature. Like if someone asked you, how often do you drink alcohol? Some people tend to under-report or give a lot lower answer because of the stigma towards drinking a lot of alcohol. Another is socially acceptable answers. So if someone asked if you use corporal punishment with your children, it's typically socially acceptable to say no to that. So people might lie and say no if they feel like they're going to be judged by other people. And then interview bias. So, for example, here, there was a Detroit race riots in 1967. So interviewers asked a sample of Black residents in Detroit if they felt they could trust most white people, some white people, or none at all. When the interviewer was white, 35% answered most, and when the interviewer was Black, only 7% answered most. So they were biased because of the interviewer being white. They felt compelled to say that they trusted most white people, whereas when someone was their skin color, they felt like they could give more truthful answers. The next one is called ignorance, which is a weird way to think of a type of bias, but it is a form of bias. So people will give silly answers just so they won't appear like they know nothing about the subject. So people, if they think it's something they should know, but they're ignorant about it, they'll give an answer. So there's a example of this in a study where educators were asked how they would rank Princeton's undergraduate business program. And in every case, it was rated among the top 10 departments in the country, but Princeton doesn't offer an undergraduate business major. So people were ignorant of the fact of what Princeton offered and whether or not they had a business program. So they felt like, oh, it's Princeton, it should be a very good school, I'll rank it really high, even though it didn't have one. So they didn't want to feel judged by the fact that they didn't know about the program. Next, we have something called lack of memory. So that's when you give a wrong answer simply because you don't remember the correct answer. So a very common thing here is if students are asked to report their grade point averages. So over 17% of the students reported a GPA that was 0.4 or more above their actual average, and about 2% reported a GPA more than 0.4 below their actual GPA. So most of the people who were asked inflated their GPAs because they just didn't remember what their GPA was, so they figured, oh, it's got to be pretty high. We also have timing. So timing can also lead to bias. So when a survey is taken, it can have an impact on the answers. So in January, which is right before the Super Bowl, if the NFL reported a poll that revealed the football as the nation's favorite sport, that is poor timing because it's right before the Super Bowl. Football is very popular in January and February, so it's not the best time to ask what the favorite sport is, or even to report on, oh, this is the sport that's most watched, it must be the favorite. And then last one we have is phrasing. So the way you ask the question can actually lead to bias. Huge differences in results based on phrasing. So for example here, if you asked, should the president have the line item veto to eliminate waste? 97% said yes, because eliminating waste is important. But if you rephrase it to just say, should the president have the line item veto? Only 57% said yes, because taking out that to eliminate waste completely changed what you were asking. The first one was very, very specific. The second one was way more general. So that can lead to bias as well. So those are the types of bias that are the most common. There's a couple other ones, but those are the most common forms of bias. There's also errors, or it's not really bias, but it's an error in how you collect your data. So the first one is called sampling error. And that happens when the difference between a sample result and the true population. It's just the difference between a sample result and the true population. And then this error results from chance variation. So it's not like it's a purposeful error. It just happens based on like who that sample was. So there are ways to lower sampling error to make sure that the difference between your sample result and the true population isn't so large. So we have an example here where you have 50 red and 50 green balls in a bag. You shake that bag to mix them thoroughly and you randomly select 30 balls. So in the sample, you find that 12 of the balls are red and 18 of them are green. So that is a 2-to-3 ratio, which is a lot different than the true population ratio of 50-to-50. So the reason that this difference happened is due to sampling error. So any experiment involving a sample will have a sampling error. So we minimize that sampling error through a lot of different techniques. And the most obvious one is to increase your sample size. So if I had instead randomly selected 40 balls from the bag, increasing my sample size would hopefully lower that ratio to be more similar to our true population ratio of 50-50. Now, obviously, it's hard to know with sampling error unless you know what the true population makeup is, what the sampling error, if there's sampling error and how big that error is, which is why we tend to always take larger sample sizes so we can limit that sampling error. There's also something called non-sampling error. So it occurs when the sample data are incorrectly collected, recorded, or analyzed. And this usually occurs when the sample is selected non-randomly. So in this case, it wasn't a problem with our sample size. It was the problem after we collected the data. We either collected it wrong, we recorded it wrong, or we analyzed it wrong. So it had nothing to do with how large of a sample we took. It was just everything after that was something wrong happened. So, for example, if a school had a new grading policy and the administrator stood outside the library during a common time and asked a sample of 50 students if they agree with the new policy, finds that 25 out of the 50 students sampled agreed, but when the entire student body was asked the opinion, 30% were only in favor, whereas 70% were against. So the difference here between our sample percentage of 50% and our true population percentage of 30% is due to non-sampling error because the sample was collected so that a lot of bias was involved. So we used convenience here. So you end up with a non-sampling error more often if there's some form of bias involved in the way you collected your data. So for here, it was convenient sampling. Another very, very common is if you do voluntary response as a method of collecting, you're much more likely to get a non-sampling error. So that's why you have to be very, very careful of how you collect the data, is that you want to make sure you also limit your non-sampling error, which is why we use SRS or simple random sampling, because it minimizes that non-sampling error a lot. So let me know if you have any questions about the different forms of bias or what bias is or our errors in sampling.